What's up, guys? This is Alien Slayer with part 2 of my recent theory series on 5-card PLO paired boards as the 3-bet caller out of position. We covered in part 1 the flop play and looked at a blank turn. So I want to continue by looking at a very dynamic turn that brings both a second flush draw as well as multiple straights. And of course, a lot of both possibilities. And to start off, I want to look at different turns and how their leading frequency varies. We can see at first glance there's almost no potting going on, so there's either half potting or checking. And the boards with the highest double barrel frequency are the very dynamic straight completing turn cards, Queen, Jack, and 9 with a second flush draw, followed by a couple of blanks, like the 8s, the 7s, then in similar frequencies, an offsuit Queen, offsuit 9 is also up here, and Jack, more blanks. So then the wheel cards, slightly lower frequencies, but all more or less in the same ballpark between 50-ish to 60%. And then on the flush completing turns, the frequency drop gradually. Also now on the straight and flush completing turns, it's rather low, as well as on just the rand. I wouldn't read too much into the other numbers. Overall, we just see the flushing turns hover between 40 to 47% of donking frequency, and then where not donking, I mean double barreling, and that's by that time. And then where the frequencies really drop off is at the pairing 10, trip kings on the board, and of course on an ace turn, it's basically a full range check, since that flips the polarity advantage completely. So we're gonna dive into this specific turn now, also so we see what is the response after a bet. We see again quite a lot of calling, supposed 4% raising range, but I would disregard it, as I mentioned in the previous part, that when it's such a low frequency, it's just so difficult to implement and can easily lead to being completely unbalanced. It's just whenever it's a spot where it's very difficult to find bluffs, likelihood is that we end up very value heavy, and 37% folding going on. And we can see also the corresponding frequencies. So apart from the ace board where there's no donking going on, there is very low raising frequencies, a bit more raising going on the pair 10, where, as we just saw, there's also less betting going on, and there was also a non-negligible portion of potting going on a pairing 10, so that kind of is a unique case, but we're not going to focus on that since it's just one of all the possible turn cards, basically. So after we established once again these dynamics that we already saw on the flop, where the out of position player remains very aggressive and the in position player very passive, we see what happens when it gets checked through, and we see almost the same frequency as on the flop already, 36% half pot size betting from the in position player, which the out of position player responds with a lot of folding, but also a healthy portion of check raises, against which we see that the in position player was basically bet folding with half of his range and calling off the rest, since now it becomes pretty linear what hands we will get into what hands he's playing with that line. So if we start from the beginning, we'll check now the value hands. So if we say everything, all the boats, since that is like that point, the biggest point, so greater or equal than 10s. Since out of position has to manage that task that we already saw on the flop, that he needs to put some of his strong hands into slow plays, both as check calls as well as check raises. We see he's continuing to bet with 79%, checking mainly when he has an ace, the nut flush draw blocker, backdoor flush draw, hands that block many of in positions possible continues. And he's betting as well with the rainbow version, actually having no flush draw interaction at all is the best combinations to bet, are the best combinations to bet. Or otherwise, yeah, just at that point it's kind of likely to have some kind or another of flush draw blocker or flush draw, but that doesn't influence too much the frequencies. We check how that looks like range-wise. Yeah, they're just too many categories. Maybe we filter out the lowest, the less likeliest categories. And if we now look into King 10, we just put it up here since that, so King 10 or King Jack to look like for the overboats, since 10-10 on that board is not really happy to stack off. So we see these are even more aggressively played and checking mainly with an ace and betting again the rainbow versions or with a single blocker. Surprisingly, the backdoor nut flush draw, having a hand like ace, king, jack, well, whatever, 9-8, seems to be it's checking with the queen. If we dive, and betting. It's just a lot of random stuff, of course. Again, here also betting with the queen. So I would suppose these are more intuitive to me. These having like two dangler side cards, a low pocket pair, or some other random cards that don't interact with the board, since they unblock more of the continuous for imposition. But as we can see, we don't have to be too deliberate about it, and we can just or too picky basically, and we can just following through and orientate mostly around unblocking the nut flush draw, since that will open up some continuous. Let's see, since we remember that on the flop a lot of jacks combinations were leading out, so let's see if those continue to play aggressive, and we see they do, since imposition will still have a lot of ace kings that he didn't raise on the flop with, and pretty sure he is obliged basically to continue with all his trips facing a bet. So jacks, of course, blocking a lot of boats is a great hand to do so. Would assume, since a lot of them were like jack 10 combos, these should be played very aggressively. Even some potting mixing in, but like I mentioned, I wouldn't do it personally, since it's just makes it easier for imposition to play, and finding much more easy folds that have a harder time getting away for a half pot size. And let's see how against the pot size bet, there's of course much more folding going on, and suppose they're out of this tiny fraction that 23% of bet full pot and fold. But yeah, that doesn't sound very practical to me, so I will ignore that. And if we now check for anything that is smaller than 10-10, but does include a king, so straights and trips basically, we can see that the category is definitely starting to slow down, but it's on the same token still betting at a quite healthy frequency. So if we look separately, then now first at only trips and then at only straights, so we see a king is actually played more aggressively, since of course he has still the blocker quality, so by blocking a king, blocking the boats, and has equity against straights, so makes sense to play that combo, that type of hand still more aggressively. Same pattern always. When we have the nut flush draw, basically it's always a good starting point to check. We need less protection, and we unblock the value hands, and we block continuous that we like, namely aces with the nut flush draw. We definitely want that with the heart nut flush draw. We want these hands to continue. I believe to remember that a lot of aces with backdoor nut flush draw were already folding on the flop if they didn't have anything else going on from the board for them, so that's less of a concern. And as before, the less flush interaction we have, the more a king is continuing to bet. So let's see what combos are here. Yeah, just random. I'll go trip ace, king, queen, 5-5. These seems to be potting hands. Let's see. Well, now I said to myself, I don't want to look into these potting spots. So even if we simplified it all to half potting, here then we see, although without a pocket pair, without trips, these hands then are, or even with a pocket pair now, they start to just half pot. So we just treat all that category as half pots. Hands that have poor equity, they do block, of course, ace queen, although these are all combos with aces actually. But even without aces, then blocking out an ace and a 9 for numerous straight outs. These seem to be very popular in betting. And if we look now at straights that are less than 10s and don't have a king, so ace queen. Since ace queen obviously is, let's look at these two straights separately. We see, yeah, ace queen is still reasonably aggressively played, whereas queen 9, of course, needs to be much more cautious. Well, surprisingly, not really. Suppose it will still include a lot of, jack or 10 combos, and since blocking a queen already starts blocking ace queen, so not too worried about that. Same patterns always emerging, trying to avoid having the ace of hearts when betting. So well, that still includes ace queen as well, so we kind of need to make it smaller than ace queen. Yeah, now it gets a little bit more passive, and again, yeah, avoiding to bet with hearts and betting with everything else. And yeah, looking into the queens, so now would be like if we look overall, trying to see into the hand classes, which hand classes solver likes to continue betting. But overall, I think that the trend is pretty clear that slowing down or checking more combos that have a flush draw, especially the nut flush draw or just the ace of hearts blocker, and continue betting without the hearts. The backdoor flush draws are not that relevant in that spot, and a king trips are still a good hand to continue betting for the most part, to deny equity basically, and still having outs to improve against straights or lower boats. By lower boats I mean under folds basically, since of course against king 10 most hands don't have much equity anymore. So we see also with the percentage of our range how it's pretty linear. Well, the 2 pair, which is pretty strong combo, that it would be probably some kind of jack 10 combos. I think that would be it could also be pocket queen. So now we're going to look into the bluff part, since we see there's still quite a heavy bluff component, of course, necessarily to balance all the value. Since we see we have almost 30% boats, and most of them like to continue betting, whereas trips is a rather small percentage, and as just talked about, straights. And then we see an overpair would be aces at that point, and no pair is pretty negligible, the percentage. So if we look now into queens, for example, that are smaller than queen 9, it's smaller than a king, since that should, yeah, these not that big of a part of our range anymore, but played very aggressively, and any jack 10 combo as well. So that's everything that we still have ranging, yeah, between under the gun we don't have that many disconnected like double suited semi-connected rundowns like Queen Jack 10, 7-6 or stuff. But even the one gap, although just having something like Jack 10, 9-8, yeah, all these, everything that is not a straight at that point, but does block a Jack or a 10, is played very aggressively. Also, any Jack for that matter, I would assume. So it shouldn't be that difficult to find your bluffs. Basically, we don't have that many, and everything that blocks both basically, and even if it doesn't have great equity, it's still worth firing. Since if we now start looking into the impositions player response, we'll look at the hand classes first to get a quick overview. And we'll also find out how often aces are going to be folding. So over pairs, 81%. We see it's 70% of his range are over pair or aces, and he's folding almost all of them. So his calling range now, it's okay. That should be included. That was with the filter less than trips, but already still a good indication that an over aces without weaker than trips are folding for the most part. Guess the only ones are like, we will see now in detail if aces with a flush draw are starting to fold. I would assume yes, if they don't have any blockers to the board. But so here we see still, yeah, the over pairs now the frequency just got reduced to about a third. Two pair, which would be this what we just mentioned, this kind of bluffing region, the Queen Jack 10x. Like now it's going to continue more, since it had also potential river bluff possibilities, and of course the blocker stuff are blocking boats. Straights are almost always calling, 10% folding. Trips always calling, and boats always calling. Of course, again, we disregard the raising ranges to simplify. And we see that trips are never folding, so we don't even need to get to look, and they're always, if they don't fold, so we treat them as always calling. So everything that is ace, ace, king is, or any, we don't have many other king X at that point. I would, that in our 3-betting range, button versus UTG. So let's have a look into the aces that are weaker than, well, if we look overall at aces, that which includes all, we better start from we start at weaker than trips and work our way up to see. So the ones that are even doubles, so we see here with a double flush draw or double nut flush draw is still folding over a third of the time. And yeah, with 3 hearts or 3 spades, it's folding even more often. And then I would assume the combos that, let's see if blocking a jack, how that alters the frequency. Now with basically with a double flush draw, we need to have a jack or probably a 10 for that matter. 10 is still folding more often. So a jack, ace, ace, jack is a very good combo. So, and if we exclude a 10 or a jack, probably the folding frequency will be much higher, and we see 100% folds of a lot of these combos here. 3 hearts, nut flush draw, bear nut flush draw blocker, nut flush draw plus backdoor nut flush draw blocker, and so on and so forth. So really time to consider folding many of these hands. And if we check now for the nut straight, smaller than a boat, yeah, that all straights have to continue basically. Again, such a low folding frequency that we can ignore at that point. So as a rule of thumb, aces with trips or with the straight need to continue against that donk, whereas flush aces without a jack or a 10, even if they have flush draws, should be folded at that point, since they, of course, that means they would lack any king, queen, jack, or 10, all these relevant cards that just smack bang the UTG's range that he's incentivized to play aggressively with. If we look any further, since there's no raising range, there isn't any point in looking at the strong hands. We can just check frequencies to see how often in position. Yeah, here's a healthy 8% of king jack. So that's definitely a point to keep in consideration. So if we look at queen 9, that doesn't have a king and is not ace queen or stronger. You see that's also the low straight also needs to continue for the most part. It's not a big part of the range, but still important for, again, due to given the basic logics. If it doesn't have an ace, it doesn't have a king, so that very likely it has some kind of jack 10 with it, since these queen jack 10 9 combos are the only ones that are getting 3-bet in these positions. So if we look for a combo like this, still weaker than his queen. Yeah, these, of course, having a jack or a 10 blocker, a little bit of folding going on, but not really sure how he still comes up with. Yeah, although it seems to be kind of bugging here that he's still including ace queen combos, even though we have them removed. So, but it doesn't make a big difference anyways. Here he's folding some ace queen combo. Yeah, no problem. So we kind of tailored out our strategy here. So now let's look into the next branch of the tree. So if it goes check, which hands are we going to see the preflop raiser betting now? Since he also needs to master that challenge of including some slow plays in his checkbacks to keep his river range protected in that call checkback line. So we see full houses are only betting at a 66% frequency. Going to dive into which ones are more prone to bet. 2 pair is that bluffing region that we saw now that consists of any board pair or pocket queens. Trips played somewhat aggressively, whereas straights and aces are played very passively. And we can see how the full houses try to complement that bluff catching range. We don't have the means here in Vision to look into river play, but it kind of becomes obvious that on the river, hands with blocking boats are going to be used as bluff catchers, and some slow plays are well suited to apply more pressure. So let's see, we compare all the different boats to see how aggressive they're going to be played. So King Jack with aces, for the most part, always flush draws, same pattern as always, are the most likely ones to get slow played. But overall, of course, pretty high aggression all over the board. So King 10, so here we had 71%, King 10, 73, almost the same. Again, ace, King 10 are probably, obviously by having aces, we're blocking ace queen, which we will find out soon if that's a combo that's oftentimes in the out of positions range, in his check calling range. So without an ace, that changes. Well, surprisingly, it didn't have that effect. So yeah, having a single ace along the way seems to be still a pretty high incentivized to continue betting. So now let's check for jacks. Jacks are decent bluff catch, not a slow play candidates. They're played much more passively, given they have less to worry about. A lot of the King X is less likely that they boat it up. But on the same token, of course, King X is still having outs, and jacks don't really love to see a check raise, since they are easily drawing dead against overfulls. So yeah, again, jack with an ace or two aces for the most part played passively, and with just a single ace and just backdoor flush draws or single blocker are played the most aggressively, whereas with hearts they are mostly checked. And pocket tens played even more passive at that point. It's a very small portion of the range anyways, so, and I don't think we need to look, it's pretty intuitive again that although Jack 10 that is weaker than a king, that these are prime bluffs that as we saw in that hand classes list, and whereas aces that are weaker than trips, I could imagine a certain portion of them being bet for, it's a rather small frequency, and it's mainly to deny equity with their blockers. Again, not blocking hearts. With hearts, of course, is also potential equity to realize, less incentivized to bet, whereas here with backdoor flush draw, not flush draw blocker, it's just nice to fold out some eventual equity, some kind of 10-9-8 or whatever, or like with low spades hands that out of a position didn't follow through since it didn't have enough blocker potential, but still has a lot of equity against bare aces. And if we check having a jack blocker, it definitely boosts up the aggression. Jack 10 itself not that much, since once again it has actually more equity to realize. But yeah, we see mainly around the backdoor flush, not flush draw or blocker, the betting evolving. And it's important to keep always in mind that it's not a crime to bet fold aces for protection, quote unquote. It's more, it's much more these old-fashioned terms of bluffing, value betting, and protection. It's just not relevant anymore nowadays. It got discussed a lot of times in different videos, but it's all just about EV realization. And if you can deny EV for your opponent and you make sure that you realize your EV with a hand, it really doesn't matter how to categorize a hand. If it serves that purpose, that's always a good reason to bet, or in other circumstances to check. So after looking into aces, he's as we stated by now, there aren't that many combo. The bluffing frequency, I think from seeing at the hand classes, that kind of gave a good overview. Maybe a king that is weaker than trips that are weaker than a boat is worth looking into. And we see, so ace king likes to bet blocking a flush draw, a nut flush draw, or not having any flush draw interaction at all. These hands need equity, they benefit from fold equity, and having a flush draw makes it much more prone to check. Pretty logic so far. So let's hop into the next step of the game tree after facing a bet. So out of position, what is he going to do? First we look at the hand classes. And we haven't looked into it as a per se, but the imposition is very likely, since he's slow playing a lot of boats, most likely he's slow playing boats that block in position, out of positions, continuing range. So hands like the 4 or 5 card Broadway rundowns, like ace king queen jack 10, these type of hands, or king king jack 10, just blocking, or with a queen there somewhere in the middle. Since now we are going to see how out of position is actually going to perform with straights. We see here he's folding 29% of straights, continuing with 50%, and actually check raising 20% of straights. I imagine those have a king with them. Still same rookie mistake. Forgot to take out the filter, so that gives us a better idea now. Yeah, but it's just these universal GTO principles of where to draw the slow plays from, which hands to play aggressively. So it would be either the hands that don't comfortably value bet turns and rivers, or don't want to face a check raise on the turn, don't get bet by the imposition player, and then the hands that just expect too many folds are also best suited as a slow play. So now that we have the full range, we see trips are actually getting check raised very aggressively, and full houses at a reasonable frequency, of course, and then some of the straights. Straights will include straight with trips, of course, so we're going to look into which straights like to check raise and which want to fold. And of course, now it's pretty straightforward. We need to have some kind of value hand. There's not a single, the numbers here say 90, 98, 99 respective, but it should not be, there isn't any continuing with less than a straight. So once again, we start with the weakest, continue, even though it looked bugged. I don't know why. Well, if we just exclude an ace, then that makes it much easier. So half of queen nines get folded. The ones with flush draws are more likely to get called. Pretty linear. Then if we add board pair, jack or 10 or both, with jack 10, of course, much more continuing going on. So if we now look at king, that is weaker than a boat. Like low straight with trips is played. It's a tiny fraction though of the range, so not worth to look too much into it. If we also now look at all the straights, the range doesn't become that much bigger, but still worth mentioning that it could look a little bit counterintuitive having like showdown value, like a hand like ace king queen with two low side cards, I would imagine. Let's see if we spot some example hands. Yeah, exactly. Here with a flush draw included and just two low side cards, or these hands seem to be like by the solver or just by blocking the overfull to have equity against some, especially having the ace and the queen, to have even outs against queen jack is pretty helpful here. So if we look specifically at ace king queen, that's weaker than a boat. We see this category gets played very aggressively and mainly just check called with a nut flush draw or a double flush draw. So after having covered these value bet spots, we should also have a look what hands are actually stab folding from the preflop raiser. So after he faces the check raise, we see that roughly half of his range is actually folding, and we can get a first glimpse at the hand classes to see if anything borderline is going to occur. Well, we see that trips are a huge part of the bet folding range. If we activate the percentages, see straights are almost never folding, small percentage, but I think we should focus on the trips. By overpair, we see there are a lot of aces actually that are bet folding. Now, if we look at some examples like of the highest percentage category, we see flush blocker and a straight draw. So hands that block some of his continues, UTG is continuous, with the ace functioning as not straight blockers, jack as a boat blocker, of course, and the ace of hearts as a not flush draw blocker that oftentimes comes with connected side cards that will hit the board in some way or another. So we see having a board pair together with aces and a flush draw, even the jack of hearts helps. Another additional straight draw blocker here in this case, but even with low side cards, still the ace jack seems to be a very prominent bluffing candidate, or the ace 10 as well with the very low blocker. So yeah, then here we have the backdoor flush draw, not flush draw blocker as well. So aces seem to be a pretty good candidate for as a bluff basically. And from the trips, I would assume we see here the categories which are also the most likely ones, are gut shot without a flush draw. And if we see this category, it also has a flush blocker. This is as how we know by now how GTO works, that stacking blockers to continuing ranges is always a very good thing to do when choosing your bluffs from kind of tight condensed ranges, since we know all the continuing ranges have some board interaction at that point. And we can see some hands that the solver is bet calling. I don't know if in practice that is such a good idea against the general population across most stakes and sides. So having like ace king with low side cards, for example. But that's how GTO would play it. And then we see having less boat outs, basically outs against straights and underfolds that don't have a king. We see, at least with these lower cards, we have quote unquote, we have clean kickers if our opponent doesn't have an overfull. So that definitely boosts equity. At that point, we don't need that much more equity to call it off here. So in that sense, it's understandable if out of position player is playing reasonably aggressive here, check raising not only strong boats. And then we see the hands that are folding are ace king. Again, I'll here all the time blocking the ace. That's just the category that we chose. See if we spot something with, I guess there's a good rule of thumb, just ace king, no pocket pair in our hand is bet calling, and ace king with a pocket pair, in this case here mainly aces, is bet folding, since it really hurts our equity having a couple of outs less to boat up. So let's see what else. Well, that was already the trips. That's probably summoning up the trips category quite substantially. See if we have a look in some other cases. My guess is that these ace king are popping up all across the board. So if we go back to just filtering for ace king smaller than a straight, we should probably see that confirmed. Not sure. Let's see without any filter. And let's just manually exclude king jack, king king, jack jack, 10-10. Oh well, any jack basically, any 10, and any queen that would give a straight. So finally somehow we got there. So we see this is quite a substantial part of the range, and it's folding. So as we saw overall, most of our bluffs are coming from aces. You can see also how big of our range is actually aces of our betting range. So from our aces we're bet folding more than half or close to 2/3 of our aces, which are 42%. So definitely makes sense given the tightness of the preflop ranges and so on. And I think that sums it up pretty well. As we saw, we have plenty of fold equity since out of position was also leading with a very large range, which included a lot of kind of blocker mergy type of hands that are now too weak once the ranges got stronger to continue. And of course at that point we can also have a look how he's playing his overall range. But yeah, at that point, of course, there are not many bluffs included anymore, since the ranges are just too strong in place. So the fold equity, even though we saw there's still quite a bit of fold equity, but yeah, we see also trips are playing actually as a semi-bluff, well, quote-unquote semi-bluff, like equity preserving, like folding out opponent's equity and realizing its own equity. Boats are played as a mixed strategy, and straights are as well mixing in folds, calls, and raises, as we already touched on before. Not going to get into that, but we can see all the bluffs that were part of the flop betting range are now just folding. So all bare aces, all kind of pocket pairs, straight draw blocker, board pairs, hands like queen, queen, jack 10 and whatnot. If they're not in his betting range anymore, they're check folding. And yeah, so all the air. So that's why the range that's why the button is still folding, step folding quite a bit, since we see there are literally no bluffs anymore in the check raising range, and the button acts accordingly. All right, I think that got longer than I expected on a specific turn, but very valuable information to be gained, in my opinion. I hope you guys agree with me. And to a certain extent, that can, of course, be projected into a queen or a 9 as well. And the same if the board is slightly different. If the board started off with queen, queen, jack, and then the turn brings a king or whatnot. Slight variations, but the main takeaways are how both in position and out of position player are constructing their ranges accordingly, and which hands are falling into which category, and for the 3-better, of course, how to utilize his ace-ace combos the most efficient way, must plus EV way. So, alright, that was Alien Slayer for runonce.com. Peace out.